In this video, we're going to go through the process of taking our partials and making them independent and reusable even outside of our own controller. To do that, we'll have to take our partial and actually wrap it inside of an action. And these actions will be called child actions. And the reason for this is that from any other view, we can make a reference to an action in controller, with the end goal being that we can then take that result of that partial and embed it into any other view or web page. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to create a partial using a child action that will actually give us a static read-only representation of this user that we're editing. So kind of up here as a header, it would give us the user information for the user that we're editing without actually having to put it directly into this page. And the reason why I want to make it an independent piece is that I ultimately want it to be reusable. I want to be able to later create a orders page and then be able to embed or inject the user information, the user who placed that order, into that page without having to recreate the actual pieces of the page that represent the user data. And then as the user evolves, if I add additional properties to our user class, I can then go back and make changes to that partial view, and then all of the places where I reference that partial automatically get updated, and that information gets spread throughout the entire application, essentially in one somewhat seamless step. So to start, we'll jump into our project, and if we look here, this is our account controller. So what I'd like to do is I want to create a new public action, and I'm going to call it get user info. And instead of returning view, we're going to return partial view. And then what we're going to actually take in here will be a user view model. And then we'll pass that view model directly to our partial. Now the final thing we need to do is add this attribute called child action only. And what that does is it says that this action cannot be called via the URL. If we were to type in, without this attribute, if we were to type in /account/get-user-info, in theory, we could actually go and fetch our user and then get that partial to render out as just a very simplistic web page. In reality, what we want is we want this to be only accessible by making a call to it from another view. It becomes a child action. So to do that, we have to add this attribute called child action only. So then we'll right click and we'll say add view. We'll call it get user info. And I'm going to go ahead and select the empty template because I already have a template that I want to use, and I'll say user view model, and then I'll go ahead and I will hit add. So it'll generate this empty partial view. I'm going to go ahead and paste my code in here. And this is the code that I've used to generate my partial. Now there's some pretty in-depth styling and CSS going on here. If you're interested in more information about the CSS formatting that's used, I would recommend looking at getbootstrap.com. And that site is a site that's actually maintained by the people who build Twitter. And it is the CSS framework that they use in the development of Twitter. That framework is actually endorsed or supported by Microsoft, and it comes pre-packaged with most of your ASP.NET MVC applications. So if you're interested in more of how you use the framework, how you use the styling markups, I would recommend checking out getbootstrap.com. Alright, so we now have our view in place, and we have our action in place. So the final piece that we need to do is actually bring them together, and we're going to do that in our edit view. So here I have a little comment that says partial here. I'm going to replace that. And now in our previous lecture, we did html.partial, and then we put in the name of the partial, that CSHTML file. Here we're going to say add html.action, and then we're going to put the name of the action, and that's going to be the piece that kind of wires it all together. If this action lived in a different controller, we could do comma, we could say the controller name. For us, right now, it's the account controller. I can go ahead and be explicit about that. But because this view lives inside of the account controller, it is not necessary to do that. It'll infer the controller from the controller that owns this action or owns this view. But we'll go ahead and be explicit. So then the next piece that we're going to do is we're going to pass in what are called route values. Now to pass in route values, what this does is it allows us to do is pretend like we're passing in route data that would normally come through either a post or that would come through the query string parameters of a get. So if we look back at our action, we'll see that we're expecting to have come into this action a user of get type or of type user view model. So we want to replicate that as a binding action. So if I flip back over here, we're going to say new curly brackets, and this is called an anonymous type. And the way that an anonymous type works is that the compiler will actually generate a class at compile time, and that class will be unique, and it's basically based off of a key value pair. So since the parameter name here is user, I'm going to go ahead and create or tell it that I want a property called user, and I'm going to set that property equal to the model class of this particular view. The model here is a user view model, so that's the perfect model to pass into this action. So what will happen is that this new class or object will get created with a property called user. That user will get picked up by the binding engine, and it'll actually get passed into this property, or this parameter. This parameter will then be passed to the partial view. The partial will pick that up, and it will do its bindings, and then we'll end up with the results of our actual page. Now, again, from the previous lecture, I did a debug, and I started without debugging. So I'm going to go ahead and F6 to build, and then I'm going to flip back over to my web page. And if I just simply do a refresh here, we'll see now that we have this nice little user details header that appears with our user information, email address, birth date, and username. Now, these look like text boxes, but they're actually read-only. They're static, just text within a nice little frame, and then these text boxes are active. So I can make modifications here without affecting the actual text that currently resides in the database. So this is a quick example of how we can then take these actions or take these partials and wrap them inside of an action, and then it allows us to then call those actions passing in the model data that we want to use for those actions.